All right, so we are live with another Pay Practitioners panel. So again, uh, we are a group of compensation consultants, and we are here today to really kind of talk shop. So we'll do a quick round of introductions in case this is your first time joining the practitioners panel. Myself, I'm Justin Hampton. I'm the founder of the Comp Tool and have managed comp programs for about 15 years, both in the US and the UK before starting the Comp Tool. And to my right, I see we got Clay Johnson. So if you want to introduce yourself, Clay.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Clay Johnson. I currently am the director of Total Rewards and Compensation Consulting Services at GBS. And for the 15 years before that, I was in HR and specialized primarily in compensation and total rewards at companies large and small. So excited to be here. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, great. Chad, how about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Friday here. So Chad Atwell, I'm based in Denver as well. I actually see Maylee just commented she's from Denver, so welcome. Hope you're staying dry. We've had nothing but rain and hail for like the last 2 weeks. It's been amazing, just crazy weather. But I work with Red Cat Systems, which is a compensation and performance system provider. We work with a lot of software companies, financial services companies, and I work specifically with clients who are really just kind of going through compensation cycle activity, dealing with really complex plans, calculations, making sure that the tool is doing exactly what we say it's going to do and keeping the clients happy as a result.
Great. Thanks, Chad. James, how about yourself?
Thanks, Justin. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is James Citrian from the NUA Group. I'm based in San Francisco, currently in DC for my first visit to the nation's capital, which is fun. I can see the Washington Memorial outside my window. It's very hot here, though. But my background is advisory. I've been in advisory most of my career and moved from accounting to advisory some time ago. And as you can tell from the accent, I started out in the UK and advising companies across EMEA, mostly Western Europe and the Middle East. And then I moved over to San Francisco about 7 years ago. And since then, I've mostly been working with VC-backed or high-growth early-stage companies. And I kind of cover as much as I'm allowed to of total rewards, but an area of particular interest is the art and the science of manager training. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. And Catherine, round us up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Catherine Gompos. I founded Gompos Group in September. Prior to that, I headed up global compensation for a Series C tech startup. And prior to that, I spent about 15 years consulting, primarily in the compensation space, but total rewards, HR consulting as well. And I'm excited to be here with you guys and talk about really where the rubber hits the road when it comes to designing comp programs. It's all about communication and getting the managers and employees understanding that and trained on it. And I'm based here in the DC area. So James, welcome to our neck of the woods.
Oh, I didn't realize. Okay.
Yeah. We'll have to find a minute offline to see if you can get coffee while you're in town.
Absolutely.
Well, fantastic. Well, and I think, so what we've done in our previous, this is our third Pay Practitioners panel. And what we've done with our previous panels is after we wrap them up, we send a poll out that says, what would you like us to talk about next? And we'll typically have a couple of different options. And this is the one that won for this week's conversation. And really, I think as everyone kind of mentioned, compensation is where the rubber hits the road. It is a big challenge for folks, especially as pay transparency has become proliferated around the US and Europe as well now. Everyone's a compensation analyst. And so really being able to communicate what compensation means to your managers and how to train folks is a really, really important subject. So I posted a question earlier this week on my LinkedIn profile. So if you don't follow me, please do. We post lots of polls. And the question was, how many manager trainings do you have or how many times do you have formal conversations with your employees about compensation? And the numbers may or may not be surprising to you, but the options were 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and 5 beyond. Just anyone want to guess how many people said, what percent of people said they've got 1 to 2 meetings per year?
Over half.
Over half.
That would be my bet.
That is a good bet because if I can actually find it, I think it was about 70% actually said that they only have 1 or 2 trainings, formal conversations with employees per year. So that doesn't feel like enough. What have your experiences been? I'll open up the panel. What have your experiences been with companies you've worked for in terms of how frequently training is taking place?
Yeah, in terms of experience, my own experience, I guess my own experience is a little bit weird because I'm usually the comp person. but but I think usually that seems pretty standard. I mean, I think oftentimes it coincides with a performance and merit cycle, and maybe there's some training given in advance of running one of those cycles, or maybe afterwards when conversations are supposed to be had about merit increases. And so I think because that tends to be an annual cycle at a lot of organizations, there's just that one opportunity, kind of obvious opportunity to give managers maybe a one pager or a quick email on what they should say to their employees about compensation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really what I've seen in the past as well. And then I found that poll. So we found 25% of companies that responded said they have 0 formal conversations with employees per year. 67% said they do it once or twice per year. So you're looking at 92% of companies are having 2 or fewer conversations per year on really probably one of the most important topics to employees. And so how often do we think, or what strategies have you guys seen that have really kind of helped to move the needle in terms of manager communication and training in terms of frequency?
I think the 1 to 2 year occurrence doesn't necessarily scare me as long as it's doing it right. I think that's really kind of the main thing for me. I've worked with most companies. I've been a practitioner in the comp department. I've also been a consultant, and for the companies that do it really well, they take the annual or even sort of the mid-year comp cycle that may be happening, and they just really do it well. They provide a lot of great talking points. The HRBPs are definitely involved as being the primary support for the managers, and the managers are given, depends a lot on how much discretion they're actually being given through that process of making either salary changes or bonuses. Sometimes that can be a bit more formulaic as well. So I think the biggest thing for me is just that the managers are getting the more formal training and getting their questions answered long before they have to get into a conversation before the employee is asking them every single question that the employees are going to ask for. So having that sort of detailed formal training, frequently asked questions, support, and then of course the being able to dial up their HRBPs into a conversation, or ask them questions on the fly as it comes up. It's a huge training event for a lot of organizations, and I think I have seen a fair number of clients and companies that I've worked with where the compensation team is the training department for that particular cycle, and oftentimes the comp team isn't the best one at communications sometimes written and verbal, and certainly not formal trainers when it comes to some of these things. And so having a really great ecosystem from your HR department that includes formal trainers, people who are really excel at communications, those are all things that have to be incorporated as part of that whole process.
Yeah. I really like that last comment, Chad, because I think we struggle sometimes to not know what it's like, we don't remember to not what it's like to not know all the jargon. And so I think even a comp person with good communication skills may struggle to explain things in a way that's just, normal words that everybody else uses when they think and talk about compensation. So I like that idea of integrating other skillful trainers and communicators in the process.
I also like what you said too, in terms of, maybe frequency isn't the issue, but sort of the value and the effectiveness of the training and the communication that backs, those interventions is important. And, when you're thinking about how to communicate, right, you want to come up with a game plan that has sort of like a circular model, right, that allows for feedback. And, there's, thinking about the message and the different channels. But I think probably the tough part that is for comp practitioners is to kind of remove yourself from your role and the employer's perspective of what is trying to be communicated, and really put yourself in the shoes of the employee, right? What are they hoping communication would achieve for them? And that can kind of help drive the strategy, and then ultimately the messages and the channels that you use to deliver the message.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, we're mentioning bringing in other kind of experienced people to kind of help deliver the message. What I have seen in the past is I've partnered pretty closely with our HR business partners, and I saw Leanne mention that the L&D partners also help to partner with that. What role, in your opinions, do you think that other parts of the business should play in that communication piece? Is it comp discusses comp with the HRBPs and then expects them to pass that on to the managers? Or is it more of a partnership? Or is it, comp communicates directly with managers? I have seen it done both ways. I'm curious if the panel has got any strong opinions one way or another on both who and how we should be having those communications.
So the way I think about it is comp and benefits is one component of a fairly rich curriculum that needs to be reinforced with managers. And that's everything from providing feedback to onboarding to making sure people have work buddies and 6-month check-ins and leaving the organization. There's a whole employee life cycle that represents several components, and one of that's comp and benefits. But it's very difficult to just train managers in comp and benefits, because if you want to have a good, let's say just comp, if you want to have a good comp conversation, you need to be able to have a good career conversation as well. Because the correct way to answer questions about a merit amount and why it's 5%, not 3%, or 2%, not 4%, is that it really shouldn't matter that much. You should be much more focused on your long-term career opportunities. And that's what I'm here for as a manager. If we can get you in the right place in the company for career. So I'm not trying to move away from the comp. I want to focus on the art and science of training managers in comp. But I do want to reinforce that, and I'm going to come back to the question, that there's so much in this curriculum that I do believe it needs one overall owner, and I do believe that needs to be more of a comms person than a comp person. But the comp people should provide the intellectual and the technical expertise to fill that curriculum, to provide that. Because I think that, to Clay's point, it's really easy to forget as a comp person how much jargon we use and how many assumptions we make when having comp. Like just using the word percentile, for example. So many people don't know what a percentile is or think it's the same thing as a percentage. And I put together a training early this year, and I've done a fair amount this year because of the pay transparency legislation. And the first feedback was, you got to explain what a percentile is. So we had to have a whole couple of slides on what market data is, what these data points are, what a percentile is, what it means to be at the 50th percentile. No, it's not half of the market. Yes, it is in the middle. So to answer the question, I do think there are a few stakeholders, but I think it needs to be led by someone with the skills and expertise in communicating. And translate that into, and I hope you can still hear me, by the way. I'm getting a pop-up saying my connection's a bit spotty.
I think that's you bring a lot of really, really good points. And there's a couple of really good kind of points in the chat as well. I'll add a little funny story. We were doing training, and one of the folks asked me how could I improve my comp ratio? And I think I gave them a real answer, but kind of joked back. I was like, well, or you could also be demoted. So that would also do it. But there are a lot of, I think we as comp people oftentimes forget what a lot of the language means. And one of the things I found is really just providing a simple glossary of terms that can be posted on a SharePoint and explaining kind of just the basics can be really effective. Have you seen other companies, how they have provided tools online for folks and kind of various resources for folks. We had another question around that, and a large percent, it was over half, said that they did make those resources available. But do we find them effective? And how do you make them effective?
I think FAQs are really effective. So, and a lot of the time,
Oh, bummer.
Uh-oh.
Well, this is sad because I know what he has to say is amazing.
Well, we'll wait for him to come back.
I think one of the.
I think yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
Hotel Wi-Fi. Apologies.
All right, we'll wait for James to stabilize for a bit. Chad, were you going to say something?
Yeah, tools can be communication tools or actual like online self-service tools. And I think I tend not to see as many good tools out there that really provides the detail that people are needing. Like managers can get relatively sophisticated when it comes to modeling and being able to see different scenarios and plan for different scenarios. Like those are all things that I think we work with on a pretty regular basis, even just with our own personal finances now and everything. People are pretty mature in the way that they use some of these different tools, but organizations are slow to adopt tools that can be very helpful. And especially if you've ever worked with a large organization, compensation approaches may be different from one part of the business versus another. And it may be a difference of annual salaried population versus hourly, or it could be different divisions, just different leader styles. Those are all things that factor into the way that the compensation is actually decided and then finally paid out. So it's really difficult to come up with one common communication plan around all of that. And so you do have to have some level of sophistication. You were talking about the HRBPs. Someone mentioned their compensation business partner, which I think is still sort of an increasingly more popular approach. Is sort of, to James' point, the compensation team is really sort of like the expert in this space. They should be making sure that everything is correct and accurate and everything is designed appropriately. And then these compensation business partners are really the ones that help interpret like what is the way that actually impacts this particular part of the business. And they get to know, let's say it's the G&A function or the operations function. They get to know a part of the business really well in the way that those leaders work. And the compensation business partner might be in a better situation to even just help that organization understand, here's how it works specifically for our part of the business. We decide things sort of more from a top-down perspective as opposed to a bottom-up. And just being able to kind of give a little bit more details around that. Then the HRBPs at that point are really just kind of along for the ride. They are definitely involved in the conversation and helping to answer some questions, but they may play a little bit of a secondary role around some of that.
Yeah, and I think what I'm kind of hearing from this conversation is, right, it depends on sort of how the organization is the typical consultant answer. But it does depend on how the organization has established their HR strategy, right? Are we doing centers of excellence? Are we doing HRBPs? Kind of how do we want to deploy a lot of our programs? And I think what I love hearing is sort of a lot of these different ways of sharing that knowledge base, right? Through FAQs, through glossary of terms, through other communication methods. Which I think is really important and is probably the foundation for getting managers trained on this art of comp and science. And I think maybe, Chad, it was you earlier who brought up the point that, today they're way more involved in direct pay decisions and in communication with employees than 5-10 years ago, probably because of the wave of pay transparency and access to data online, all of that good stuff. So I feel like the baseline is, yes, get the knowledge available to managers in different ways, where it's self-service or you've got L&D facilitating different training programs. But maybe that next step is really those skill-based trainings where we're having, role plays, some of the Paul had it in one of his podcasts, which I thought was an interesting finding, right? We prepare all of these managers to have difficult conversations at mid-years for somebody who's not going to receive a great review and not going to receive the same bonus that they got last year. And then there was an interesting feedback loop that the managers felt ill-prepared to have a conversation with their high performer who's getting more, but not as much as they wanted. So I think it's that skills-based training, which really will help empower managers. But you've got to have that foundation of giving them the knowledge too.
So yeah. I'm a big fan of role play sessions. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If I cut out again, I might give up, but perils of hotel Wi-Fi. But the FAQs for me are the foundation for those role plays. So the value in FAQs, sure, they're a good leave behind, they're a good resource, but they're basically a how-to guide of how to do a role play. Now, HRBPs can get involved in that. And you can be that. You can ask the difficult question to the manager in a role play scenario, and you've got the appropriate answer in front of you, and you can practice that. And role plays are awful and horrible to do, and very, very, very painful, but they are really, really effective, particularly for those difficult questions like, how do I have a conversation about not a great merit increase or not a great high performer that's not getting quite what they might have expected, for example.
Yeah, and I think a role plays, they're fantastic, but one of the downsides is they are resource intensive. So it's hard to have a role play with a group of people. But there are only there's a limited number of potential scenarios and situations that account for 90% of the conversations that managers are going to have. So I think it is possible for managers to present the key talking points, or to present to managers the key talking points for most of those scenarios, and making those available on kind of a manager's resource guide. I have found that works pretty effectively, and making sure, again, it comes down to making sure managers know how to set expectations and that they can and are feeling prepared and confident to have those conversations.
Yeah. And I think
Go ahead, Clay.
You go ahead, Catherine.
Nope, you're up.
Okay. And I think in addition to that is, as we come up with these kind of standardized talking points, FAQs, providing even more opportunities for the individualized scenarios, right? That 10%, right, Justin, that, well, I read that, but I'm still concerned about, X, Y, and Z with this particular employee. Well, that's fine. You can have office hours, you can have whatever time set up to work through those individual conversations. And maybe have a role play with a specific individual because it's so resource intensive. But still providing that avenue, I think, for that 10% of really tough conversations is really helpful and goes a long way, I think, with building relationships with managers as well.
Yeah, I'm aligned with that, and it kind of speaks to what my thought was in terms of how you might use an HRBP if you've got that in your model. If they're kind of with the business and coaching, right, then they have the knowledge from the centers of excellence, comp professionals, and then are able to kind of walk in lockstep with the managers to improve that confidence.
I find that there's often a reticence about doing this as well, and I think that comes back to I think it was Justin that made this point at the beginning, that the people who hold the information aren't the people that are best placed to do the communication. So comp professionals and HR aren't necessarily the first people to hold their hands up and say, let's host a company-wide workshop and a series of role plays over the next 3 months. They've probably got more important things to worry about, more pressing things, right? But there is certainly a desire on the manager side that I feel like I've seen, and through the presentations that I've been party to, or the feedback that I've got from clients, is that there's a tremendous amount of appreciation from managers. And again, comp is just one aspect of all of the training that you can afford to managers. But when you provide that, very few managers, if you've selected people that want to be managers, very few will not want to be better managers. They want to be provided with the tools and resources to do their job better. And one of the most uncomfortable aspects of that job is compensation. No one likes talking about that. Yeah. So I feel like if you're kind of going down this path of trying to tackle this area better, it is going to be well received. It is going to be appreciated. It is quite a positive and engaging process to go down for the HR function. And the other thing I want to say about this is that it's actually really great for the HR function itself. It's a great training opportunity for the HR team who might not necessarily get many opportunities to provide trainings or presentations or host workshops. And it's a wonderful opportunity to skill up other people of the HR function, particularly if you're having this more than once a year, which I'd suggest you probably should be. you can kind of rotate who's driving these sessions and who's responsible for that, which is a really good internal training resource.
I love that. I mean, I think it helps a lot with sort of that culture activation, especially folks that are trying to move towards more transparent pay cultures and are really understanding kind of the well-being, psychological safety component of people at work, right? That empowerment can really help. Yeah.
And just a related comment, I think it's also a good idea to think about allowing managers to take their learning to whatever level they want, meaning consider providing more than just the mandatory manager training. For example, some managers may be interested in learning more of the specifics about, what is a salary survey? How does that actually work? And, what is the difference between cost of living and cost of labor? And I've had, as an example of how you might go about that, I've had varying degrees of success with hosting lunch and learn opportunities that are just open to whoever wants to come and learn more about the ins and outs of the comp profession and how we actually do all the analysis and all that kind of stuff, how we make decisions about comp strategy and those kind of things. So that the managers who are interested in learning beyond just the basic things, they can take their level of learning to, as high as they would like.
There was a few comments in the chat as well I thought were interesting about video shorts. Now, I'm a big fan of video shorts because they're short, digestible. Anything short is better for training. Small bite-sized chunks of training is generally more effective. But I think they're most effective as a supplementary resource personally. I think on-site, in-person training is still king. It is the most effective way to get people engaged in the session, make sure everyone's paying attention. And it also kind of communicates the importance of the session as well. If it's a sort of optional invite, then it doesn't really say this is something we believe is important. And whereas if it's an offsite that you're funding and paying for, it kind of sends a message that this is something you should be attending. So I'm a huge fan of video shorts. My question is always, how many people are watching them? So they work effectively, but it's important to monitor how many people are watching, if they're watching the whole thing. And a lot of the platforms that do host these video shorts will allow that kind of analysis on how much engagement you're getting out of them. I'm keen to hear what other people on the panel think about videos here.
I think, speaking of videos, I think it's really important to have different forms of communication or different mediums that you're passing the message along. When you want to be consistent, written or video formats that are provided to everybody and are available to your audience, I think that's really important. I think one of the things where you can also counter or at least proactively respond to the question of, are people using it this way, is to continually drive little bite pieces over to people. So do your job description templates include your compensation philosophy? When you're conducting a job family review, are you re-explaining the hierarchy? Are you re-evaluating are you re-promoting the comp philosophy? Are you explaining how ranges get put together? So I think that it has to be kind of a constant, not barrage, but a constant number of frequent touch points that are bite-sized during to continue that educational piece.
Yeah, it's a whole foundational piece there for sure. That are you building on top of a really well communicated comp strategy, philosophy, everything that you've put together that essentially defines. I always think of the philosophy as you're defining what that end experience should be like, right, for the employee. You're helping the manager even think about it from the employee's point of view, to know that the employee is going to walk away from a compensation decision feeling rewarded and motivated and appreciated. Those are all things that you want to promote through that. And here's how we encourage that and facilitate it through these annual or mid-year comp cycles that we run all the time. I think that the video piece of it, I really like. I think it's more effective, especially for managers coming into an organization to kind of get up to speed really quickly. It's more general at that point. Every manager that I've worked with over the years, they all have their own specific scenarios and questions, and they want to reward, one particular person in one way versus another person. And so it's really sort of identifying those particular specifics that managers need to address. And that can really only be done through the lunch and learns and the, really sitting down with somebody to help them answer a specific question. And if you're able to get in person or have these more online interactive type training events, I think they're much more impactful that way.
And James, you mentioned some really good points in the comments. I was going to share a couple that I thought were really good too, and see if the panel wanted to address some of the questions that at least caught my eye. Not to say they're not all good, but these are a couple that caught my eye. So Lee says she'd appreciate hearing the best approach to training managers on how to target the point of the range where employees are paid. I think we all have heard that. If I'm paid here, why isn't it a little bit higher, and how do I compare to others?
I'll happily kick this one off. Yeah, it's an FAQ that has come up a number of times. I'm sure everyone has their own visuals that you can use to talk about the factors that indicate the position in a range, and the concepts are the phrase that I'm sure we'll all use is it's art, not science. It ties into the philosophy though. What is it that we want to use to determine individual pay? For example, if you have geographic tiers, then geography isn't really a factor that will impact your position in the range. If you have national ranges, then maybe geography is a factor that would impact your position in the range. So the way I would communicate it is that it's a combination of approaches. Typically, it would include levels of experience, individual qualifications, but market supply and demand for the skills and expertise in the role would also impact pay for an individual position. But there isn't a mathematical formula, is the thing I would also say in that response as well. There's not a formulaic approach, and arriving the appropriate point in the range isn't going to happen instantaneously overnight. The final point I'll make is that there are a series of things that should not impact your position in the range, namely gender, ethnicity, etc., all these factors. So I think in the same breath as talking about the things that would impact the position in the range, we should also reinforce the things that should not impact the position in the range.
I think that's an important call out that is helpful, what should not be impacted in the decision. And I like thinking through when we design programs and we have a strategy around how we use our range, sort of articulating what are those, compensable factors, what are those things that we evaluate to determine where folks should be on the range, so that we're all thinking about the same thing. So do we at promotion time, value tenure and performance more than advanced degrees, or, whatever those things are that help make those decisions, just creating some consistency in the evaluation across managers and over time. Sometimes having that defined in your philosophy or in your salary administration guidelines can help reduce the potential for inequities.
I really like the link back to performance for sure. I feel like almost every conversation over the last couple of years, there's just been such an upheaval around pay transparency and pay equity and that sort of thing, and certainly deserved and very important. But there is, we've lost a little bit to some extent how we talk about the pay for performance connection and where that comes into play and when it should come into play, and how it affects salary is different than how it affects bonus, and your ability to measure at different levels within the organization. I feel like there are clients that I've worked with where leadership is very hesitant to have managers talk about compensation, and that's because there's not a lot of clarity around performance. There's really just not a good relationship between the way the performance and the compensation piece ties together. So from a design aspect, that's a whole other piece of it. Once you have that in place, I feel like it's a little bit more intuitive, or at least it's dependable in a way where a manager can really look at, okay, we've got individual performance here, we've got group or team performance here, here's how our overall corporate performance is affecting the budget. You can really talk about it very plainly, because oftentimes those measurements or your goal attainment, whatever it is that you're tracking from a performance perspective, is already published out there, and you're communicating that from the leadership down. And then the compensation just kind of follows on the back end of it. Is here's what's the impact of those different levels of performance, and being able to kind of track against those.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on something that you said, Chad, because I've heard from a number of clients in recent months who have expressed frustrations about trying to get more communication going in the organization because senior leadership is very hesitant about bringing up the conversations, right? Like, well, if we start these conversations, we might not have very good answers for a lot of the questions that'll come up. And so I'm just curious if others are hearing similar concerns and what your thoughts are on addressing those.
I was just going to say, along with the pay transparency topic, so many organizations take the most conservative approach, right? So whatever state you're in, or whatever sort of regulation you're applying against that population of employees, that's what the company is willing to do. And that's what I feel like leadership sort of backs up against, whatever is the most conservative position we can possibly do. And transparency is now sort of pushing those leaders into a universe of like, oh, we actually do have to talk about these things. And, the comparisons start to come up, and how are we going to address those? So I think that's traditionally very true, that leaders are hesitant and don't want those conversations to start happening again, because they don't really have great answers for it, but they're getting pushed more into the spotlight now, for sure.
I think this came up on a last call. We used the pitchforks analogy. There's this fear that the pitchforks will come out, right? And it just doesn't seem to. Or when they do come out, they're very reasonable pitchforks that they deserve to be holding. So
and leadership can take the lead literally by putting this topic out there in their, they have a quarterly leadership call, or they're doing town halls, or any of that. Those are great opportunities to literally model for your managers what this should look like. What are some things that we should be talking about when it comes to that?
Yeah, and I think too, it does help the conversations when behind the scenes you can have that opportunity to kind of proactively review and address kind of challenges that I think for a lot of us, we can create a spreadsheet, identify who's low in the range, and kind of know those are the ones when the ranges come out, or if we need to enhance our communication strategy, or we are, going on a path of transparency and need to become more communicative, we know that those are going to be the questions that come up. So you can be very proactive with what do we do with employees that know they're low in the range? What do we do with employees that are over the range? How do you explain what your career hierarchy looks like? How do we have people understand what it takes to move into the next level? One of the things I like to do, especially during job family reviews with our managers, and I use the job family review opportunity as just a training opportunity, because you spent so much time with managers and HR partners during that process, and you really have such an opportunity to dive deeply into kind of what their hierarchy looks like, how the comp is determined, that it just provides that natural opportunity. But what I would really like to do with those folks is really kind of explain to them, how can you communicate with your employees that ask, I'm a level 2, what does it take to become a level 3? As you're developing those job descriptions, as you're developing the career levels, that's an opportunity to really kind of use with managers to explain to them on a fairly small but frequent basis, because you are doing those job family reviews annually, biannually, once every 3 years at minimum. It's not a ton, but it does give you the opportunity to kind of connect with folks.
I think those leveling guides are a really good example, again, of the importance of the manager, right? So I'm sure we've seen, and I can think of examples of companies that have these wonderful, shiny leveling guides and resources, but it just doesn't mean anything if the manager doesn't know how to use them. So, we all know, we all have people, we all probably had managers that just mean that we just can't enjoy our work. If those tools aren't in the right hands, or if those people don't know what they're using, they're just not worth it. So, I'd much rather take a well-informed, experienced manager that understands the concept of a career with no leveling guides than a company that's got a really, really shiny set of leveling guides, but managers that aren't trained to use them. I think we look at those leveling guides and kind of get to the end of it and think, okay, it's done. That's it. It's so clear. That's all we could possibly need. But it just really does take that role playing and that training and that understanding to make those work effectively.
Yeah, so I was clicking around it and found a great question from Bob. So, how do you communicate how compensation is a key piece to drive the business to get both leadership and employee buy-in? I think this is a really, really great question. So I'll let the panel answer this one.
I mean, I was gonna say the first thought that comes to mind is just, I mean, obviously compensation tends to be the largest expense for any organization, but compensation and other rewards are only as valuable as they are perceived to be by the employees receiving them. And so, I mean, that just should be the driver right there. So we're spending all this money, but how is it being perceived by the people receiving it?
I think of it as well as, you've got business and financial risks, and compensation is both a business and financial risk. And there is so much research out there to show you how expensive compensation can be from a business and a financial perspective. Like if you lose key people, the business implication, the risk that's associated with that institutional knowledge that walks out the door and the cost of replacing that turnover, it's got business continuity implications, it's got financial implications, and it's got long-term strategic success implications as well. So there's plenty of research out there to show what it costs companies not to get this right. And one piece of research that I thought was fascinating recently which was by McKinsey, which is not specific to compensation, but it's specific to managers. They evaluated companies on their TSR, the total shareholder return, and they split a group of companies into those with high-performing managers and those with average or below-average performing managers. And that group with high-performing managers received multiple times the TSR of the companies with average or below-average managers. Now, they caveated, and I'll caveat as well, that doesn't necessarily show causality. It shows causation, but not necessarily causality. But it does show that companies that invest in managers, that do have good managers, tend to get long-term shareholder return out of it. So there's just plenty of research out there, and I think any good leader, any good CEO will respond to research and data to support the idea that this is an area of sensible investment.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also important to note, right, like that good communication won't repair a flawed program, right? So the assumption here is that this program is actually going to drive the behaviors that then achieve organizational goals, missions, values, all of that good stuff. And then I think if we've got that piece right, then it's really, from the employee experience, they've got to experience the awareness of it. They've got to understand it. They have to accept it and say, okay, this is what it is at my organization because it's different at every organization, and then drive that commitment, through their leadership of other employees or even just around the water cooler or on Glassdoor, right? Sort of committed to sort of this overall component to the employee value proposition.
Yeah, I'll go back to, I helped with some research when I was at Deloitte a few years back, and we really indicated that the whole idea of just being competitive with the general market was not an indicator of maturity when it came to your total rewards function at all. Everybody wanted to be, at median or better in a lot of scenarios. And so what it really did come down to is how were you setting up your expectations, making it meaningful for the employees and the managers, those kinds of things. There can always be more money thrown at a problem. And I think that's what executives tend to resist is we're not just throwing money at a problem, are we? Like, is that what we're doing? If you want to increase the budget overall from 3% to 4%, like what are we actually getting with that? And it becomes more a conversation, not necessarily just the numbers, but being able to effectively back up the messages and the philosophy that we've put out there, that we are really actively trying to stay competitive with the market, but we're doing it in a way that supports either if you have gone as far as creating some sort of total rewards brand or something that aligns to your particular brand strategy in the market, or if you're really just trying to get started and you've got a basic level of fundamentals around competitiveness and paying for performance. It's just you have to be able to really keep up with that and not fall too far behind, because the employees will be the first ones to call you out and say it's not consistent with what you put out there from a communication perspective.
And Chad, I think part of the problem is the lag as well, right? If you for 1 year
Sure.
go below market or merit, you probably won't feel the effects of that immediately. You might get 1 or 2 people kicking up a fuss, but it's the progressive impact of not meeting that philosophy over time.
That's right.
And you know, a short-term thinker might look and say, "Oh, we saved some money," you know, and say, "Well, why should we increase our pay? It's not cost us anything over the last 12 months." And the sale is it is going to cost you. It's just going to cost you over a longer time frame, and by the time you realize it's costing you, it's going to be really expensive to fix it. That's quite a difficult sell, because a lot of the time business needs are so short-term in nature.
And I think that's an important point, James, that like as we as compensation professionals propose, you know, moving from a 4% or to a 4% from a 3% or whatever, making sure that there's clarity there around how that's connected to the success of the business in the future. That saving money here is going to hurt, you know, is going to hurt business objectives over here down the road. And I personally experienced that. Ben, the one raising red flags, like, no, saving this here is going to cause this problem here. And so being able to really communicate and connect beyond just the compensation space, and helping other business leaders understand what we do with compensation has these impacts downstream to business objectives and business outcomes.
Yeah, I think everybody's really comfortable understanding sort of the real cost implication, but it's that opportunity cost loss that is a little bit tougher to connect. And that's really, I think, where, to your point, Clay, like that's where the greater understanding of how everything is connected supports kind of the business's goals.
Yeah.
And I think too, just in the age where we are at now, where we have levels.fyi, there's Glassdoor, there's Fishbowl, there are so many pieces or so many avenues for employees to go and vent or discuss or say positive or negative things about their company anonymously, that can really dramatically shift, you know, a company's general perception if enough people share a certain perspective. And I think too, that goes back to the earlier conversation where I think Clay mentioned this, that you know, one of the most important things is the perception of being how you're paid and the perception of being paid fairly. And so I do think that that's also something that we have to take into consideration, especially when we're engaging with management or leadership on, you know, how is compensation going to drive kind of the overall culture? How is it going to really move us forward on, you know, not just the cost today, but the cost, you know, a year or 2 years from now?
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, to drive home the different ways of getting feedback, right? A lot of people think of engagement surveys, pulse surveys, maybe stay and exit interviews, but to your point, Justin, that environment online gives us a very good feedback of what the perception is and how, you know, employees are receiving the communications and the design of the program.
Yeah, I'm curious. I haven't seen too many tools that have measured employees' perception of the communication. I don't know if there's one out there, but I mean, have you in your experiences seen any of those tools that kind of measure not just employee engagement, but also kind of how they feel about specific things, you know, around comp, or how they are? Better question. How would you folks recommend that employee perception of pay be measured? Is it through exit interviews? Is it through quarterly interviews? Is it through I can't remember what they're called, but the pulse readings? What have you seen effective?
I'd say all of it. The combination of all of those things, I think, really helps.
Like the next step after just the general satisfaction question is usually, I think, something along the lines of, do you understand your compensation? Like, do you even really just understand what's offered to you and why you make what you do? And just getting a baseline on that, are we scoring a 2 or a 4? Like when it comes to a scale of 5, that just gives you so much more, energy to be able to say, okay, we really, even if we do offer the best of what's available out there, we're really just falling flat on the explanation of it and why people make what they do. And let's start with some of that. Some of the utilization comes into it. Obviously, everybody utilizes their salary and their bonus, but then there's the other programs that kind of go into it. The conjoint analysis is where you get really complex and being able to kind of help people understand if they would trade a certain amount of pay for something else. But I think just that basic step of like, do you really understand the connection between you, your pay, performance, the overall performance of the organization? Those are all things that I think you could spend a lot of time just getting that amount of feedback from people, for sure.
Yeah. And I think this is really low fi, but just have a focus group. Ask a handful of employees,
Sure.
Do you understand how your pay was decided and how you got there? And do you understand, how to determine whether it's competitive or not? And pay scale does pretty regular research on things like this. And I remember reading recently one of their publications that the majority of employees do not understand whether how their pay was decided, whether it was competitive or not. Employees who were paid kind of above target thought that their pay was unfair. Below target thought their pay was unfair. So um, the research is there to show that we probably assume too much, that employees understand more than they do, or have a more accurate perception than they really do. So I think, in addition to the more anonymous survey sources, we may consider just having some conversations.
Yeah, I love that. Just sitting down and having conversations with people. I mean, that hasn't gone out of fashion yet. It's a great way to engage with the workforce. And Chad, I really agree with your point as well. It's not do you like your pay? It's do you understand it, and do you think it's fair? It's a very different thing, and you do get different answers as well. Everyone would say, yeah, I'd love more money, of course, but when you say, well, do you understand your pay? You're more likely to get a useful response. And we've kind of just done little pulse surveys asking that very question just before and at the end of training sessions, and you see people just tick upwards a little bit, maybe not overwhelmingly, but yeah, okay, I understand something I didn't understand before, so it's just about gradually trying to move that needle upwards as much as possible, which is that ongoing process.
I like that comment quite a bit.
Great one.
Yeah. Well said.
So once you open the door, many people will walk through it for sure.
Yeah. They didn't hold back.
And I think too, one of the challenges I've seen is that you have to be able to actually address the comments that come through the door. Because I think there have been, I worked for companies where they didn't want to necessarily, unlock the door because there was a fear that then we had to make those changes. But I don't think it's a good approach to simply stick your head in the sand and say, we're not, you can't do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think by doing the former, right, not doing this, you're helping sort of lead with empathy and building trust, which I think drives a whole lot of other people programs home for people a lot in that sentence. But I think, that, and to Clay and James, your earlier point too, right, just getting in front of people and talking with them and reading their energy and their nonverbals as we ask questions and we get their feedback, all of that can be really important inputs into all of the other actions that are taken from this work.
Well, we're coming up on about 5 minutes left of our third pay practitioners panel. So Ed, at this time, I'd love to get kind of final thoughts that you would leave with everyone that's joined us. So we'll go around and we'll start with Clay. Clay, any last thoughts?
Sure. I think I would say, obviously, from this discussion, we realize it's a lot of work doing all this communication, the understanding what people need, training managers, setting it up, offsites, whatever you choose. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's important for us to remember why we're doing it. and that is, in the absence of accurate, relevant information delivered to employees, they're left to create their own narratives about compensation with whatever information they can get their hands on, which is likely to be secondhand, anecdotes, misinformation, whatever, um, and they're likely to not get to an accurate understanding of their compensation or rewards without accurate information, right? So if we want to control the narrative, we need to proactively share one, consistently, clearly, transparently.
Oh, Justin, we lost your audio. There.
Sorry, I was going to say, Chad, do you have any last thoughts?
I do. I have a lot more thoughts on this one, but I'll just flip this one on its head for a minute, just to say, going back to the leadership thing, these conversations, although very much focused on employees and making sure that they understand why they're getting what they're getting, is a super unique opportunity for you to educate the employee on the business and why the business operates the way it does, what you're trying to achieve, and where compensation and performance and everything sort of fits into that. And so it's another one of those things with leadership buy-in. If you can get the leaders to really think about it as an education opportunity for the employees just to understand the business more, it actually could help create a little bit more retention and people just feeling more part of the overall organization that way.
Great. James?
I found myself recently reading some Peter Drucker texts, and in The Practice of Management was written way back in 1954, which is over 70 years ago, and it just astonished me how predictive it was and how many of the problems he identified just still exist to this day. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from him, and he said, "The job of developing tomorrow's managers is both too big and too important to be considered a special activity. Its performance depends on all factors in the managing of managers." And he wrote so much good stuff in there, but that's the one I chose.
Good quote.
Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I think to round us out, I'll echo everything that was said here. I think a lot of valuable nuggets of information, and I'll just add, that as we put together our plans and put together our materials, put ourselves in the employee shoes and just, kind of drive home what is it that they're expecting, and then how do we tie that back to what the organization is hoping from them. And so just, leading with empathy and helping to build that trust by putting yourselves in the receiver of the message and the decision's shoes.
That's great. And my parting thoughts are, I once had a manager that said he would never be upset with us for over communicating, only for under communicating. So if you have an opportunity to reach out and say, and help to educate your practitioners or your managers, I think it's great in terms of it will help you to be part of the conversation rather than the topic of the conversation. So fantastic. Well, thank you guys again. Thank everybody, especially Clay, Chad, James, and Catherine, all fantastic consultants who would be happy to chat with you guys if there are any questions specifically around some of the projects that you've got in place. But we will be joining again in 2 weeks for our next practitioners panel. We will post a poll with a couple of topics and choose the main topic based on what everyone votes for. So thank you guys again so much for joining. Really appreciate the time, and special thanks to all the panelists on board. Thank you guys again.
Thanks, Justin. And for those
Thank
of
you,
you,
everyone.
happy 4th.
Oh, happy 4th.
Yes. Happy 4th.